Matt Feldman. He is the Senior Manager, Strategic Communications at Aeras. And Matt's presentation, Vaccines, Global Health, and the Future of Fighting Tuberculosis. So I'd like to invite Matt up to the stage.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thank you to BioProcess International for inviting us and making this happen today. So I'd like to talk to you about vaccines, global health, and tuberculosis. And let's get underway. So who is Aeras? We're a nonprofit biotech located in Rockville, Maryland. Our mission, quite simply, is to advance TB vaccines that are effective and accessible to the world. We are a 501c3, a fully integrated biotech company with in-house capabilities in finance, portfolio management, manufacturing, taking products from preclinical through about phase 2B clinical trials. We are headquartered in Rockville, Maryland. We also have offices in Beijing and in Cape Town, South Africa. We're governed by a board of directors. We have advisory groups, external, internal, and a leadership team with lots of experience in public and private sector vaccine development. Ultimately, we're about 160 people with an annual budget of about $55 million, and that primarily comes from donors like the Gates Foundation and from governments around the world who support this work. So I'd like to take you back to a little bit of history where infectious diseases have shaped civilizations. Over thousands of years, we've seen this pattern repeated. If we go all the way back to the mummified remains of Ramses V, we see the scars of smallpox on his face. In 1350 BC, it was the very first recorded smallpox epidemic. More than 2,000 years ago, around 500 BCE, Hippocrates, the Greek philosopher, coined the terms epidemic and endemic based on the infectious diseases that were moving around his region at the time. As we fast forward to about 185, the Antonine Plague ravaged the Roman Empire, likely responsible for the death of Marcus Aurelius. This plague is memorialized in paintings and stories of the day, but really an infectious disease that absolutely shaped civilization at that time. 1,000 years later, Black Plague killed 90% of Europeans, an incredible event in the world. A couple hundred years later, it happened again. Plague killed 24 million in Europe. That's 30% of the population, and more than 40 million people worldwide. So these are incredible events driven by infectious diseases. And so, in the face of these events, we have vaccines, turning the tide of history. 1960, the advent of the polio vaccine, began the largest public-private partnership in history, the largest international mobilization for public health. As you see in this chart from the WHO, after the advent of the vaccine, the introduction of the vaccine, as the coverage of the vaccine rises, the number of cases plummet across the world. And in the past 20 years, more than 20 million volunteers working all around the world have immunized more than 2.5 billion children, and in an extraordinary effort. And so polio, which was found all around the world, is now endemic in just 3 countries. India, a couple of years ago, was declared to be polio-free, and a remarkable achievement. And this disease, while still a problem, exists really only in small pockets of 3 countries around the world, all credited to vaccines. 1967, smallpox, a similar story. At that time, smallpox was causing 15 million cases of the disease, taking 2 million lives a year. And so what began with a vaccine, the advent of a vaccine, over a 10-year WHO-led campaign, vaccinated out of existence what had plagued societies for centuries. It was gone. 1980, measles, far more contagious than smallpox. And in some children, it can be just as dangerous. In the space of 2000 to 2011, global measles deaths dropped 71%, an extraordinary achievement. And again, here in a similar chart, you see as the coverage of the vaccine rises, the number of cases plummet. More recent times, pneumonia, Pneumonia is the world's #1 killer of kids under 5. Most people don't know this, but in the US, the vaccine was introduced in 2000. This, over just a couple of years, was followed by a 94% decline in diseases in the US. This is a situation that isn't just limited to high-income nations. Similar data have been seen from Kenya, for example, following the introduction of the vaccine, an extraordinary drop in the number of cases in just a year and 18 months after vaccine introduction. So again, here are several examples of vaccines turning the tide of history. But what about TB? TB's Mother Nature's #1 killer over the past 200 years. A Nature analysis in 2013 showed that TB is likely responsible for more than 1 billion deaths throughout human history. But what is TB? It's spread like a common cold, transmitted by coughing, sneezing, talking, just like a cold. This year alone, 9 million new cases and 1.5 million deaths. So that's more than 4,000 deaths a day from TB. And most likely we don't hear about it. At the peak of the Ebola crisis in 2014, hysteria in the media. If you average the deaths across the year, Ebola was killing about 22 people a day. And we heard about it nonstop. Compare that to TB at 4,000 deaths a day. It's pretty remarkable. So TB is responsible for the deaths of about 1 in 4 people with HIV. It is actually about tied across the world for the number of deaths that it causes, about 1.5 million a year. And it's responsible for a remarkable amount of drug resistance. 1 in 4 new TB cases coming out of Eastern Europe are drug resistant. And the implications of that for costs are extraordinary. So, as a corollary to this figure, if you see the number of deaths from TB at 1 billion and the number of HIV deaths at in this much smaller circle, if you look at the funding, the global spending on R&D and treatment for these diseases, it's about inverted. We have an extraordinary gap between the burden of disease and what is spent on R&D and treatment. And it's an incredibly expensive disease. In the U.S., TB, a case of drug-sensitive TB costs about $17,000. Multi-drug-resistant TB, $250,000. Extensively drug-resistant TB, more than $500,000. So what is extensively drug-resistant TB, or XDR? It's referred to as Ebola with wings. There's a similar mortality to Ebola, about 30 to 70% mortality, but it's airborne. There is airborne transmission just like a common cold. As this map shows, virtually everywhere we look for data, we look for XDR TB, we find it. It's found officially in more than 100 countries. And there are at least twice as many cases last year as the total number of cases of Ebola. So XDR is everywhere. And XDR is in the U.S. too. Just last week there's a case of a patient who flew from India to Chicago with XDR TB, potentially exposing people, was then transferred to NIH under a lot of media attention and scrutiny, where this patient will be treated for at least 2 years, a very expensive, rigorous treatment. So TB is local, TB is global. There are about 10,000 cases of TB in the U.S. Across the nation, it's generally on the decline, but in cities like New York and LA, it's actually on the rise. And it's often connected to a sensitive subject of immigration, as we see with just this last week's case of XDR. So there are political sensitivities and realities to deal with as well as we fight TB here in the U.S. and around the world. So vaccines, again, present us with an opportunity to disrupt nature. We know that nature will continue to evolve threats, infectious disease threats, both endemic and pandemic. But here we know that, again, we have the power to disrupt these historical trends. We've been doing that to some degree with the BCG vaccine. This is the world's oldest vaccine at 90 years old. It reduces the risk of severe pediatric disease, TB disease, meningococcal TB, but it offers unreliable protection at best against adult pulmonary TB. And that's where the bulk of the world's TB lives, and that's where the bulk of TB transmission is in adults. The vaccine is virtually useless against this type of TB. So what do we do? The WHO, in a landmark declaration in 2014, said that new vaccines, new tools, including vaccines, will be key to eliminating the threat of TB. And so currently, TB incidence is more than 100 times higher than what is technically elimination of the disease. Elimination, you see in this chart, is the dotted line at 10. That's 10 cases per 100,000. Currently, we're more than 100 times higher than that. And the global trend of decline is about 2% a year. How do we increase that global rate of decline? Well, with the optimal approach, what's considered the optimal approach, and that's universal health care, rising socioeconomic status, some pretty ambitious things at best, we might get to 10% a year decline, according to the WHO modeling. Still not enough to end the threat of TB by 2050. So the WHO said, and again in this landmark declaration, that a new vaccine introduced around 2025 is going to be critical to ending the threat of TB, and this can accelerate the decline of cases per year. TB is a complex disease. How could these vaccines work against TB? Well, there are several stages of the disease which offer several potential breakpoints to interrupt this disease and its transmission. So one of the places where a vaccine could work is in preventing transmission and blocking infection. If it gets into the body, being able to squelch that before it becomes a problem. That's circles A1 and A2. For individuals that are infected, another potential block point could be in preventing that latent infection, just that TB bacteria resident in your body, preventing that from becoming a full-blown active infection. A vaccine could halt that progression. For folks with active disease, a vaccine could potentially offer a boost to therapeutic strategies, with drugs reducing the amount of time that a person needs to be on medicine to halt that infection, to treat and sterilize TB. So these are very, very different points in the disease and very different strategies for vaccines, for TB vaccines. So to that point, there has been a lot of progress in the last decade. When the first new TB vaccine was tested just a few years ago, since then, there have been more than 25 TB vaccine clinical trials, a variety of strategies, a variety of approaches, and a variety of locations. I'll talk about that in a second. So here is a look at the global clinical pipeline of TB vaccines. A lot of people, it is actually a surprise to them that there are TB vaccines in development, when in fact there's a whole variety of them in phase 1, 2, and 3. This is a look at all of them and that we currently know about and who's behind them. There's a variety of approaches. These are the viral vector vaccines currently in phase 1. There are a number of protein adjuvant vaccines in phase 2. The M72 product in phase 2B is one that Aeras now has a hand in a multi-country phase 2B trial that we're enrolling in southern Africa. There are mycobacterial platforms, whole cell extracts that are being tried across the range of trials around the world. And there are experimental medicine platforms, different tools, asking, for example, does a TB vaccine need to be aerosolized for it to be effective? Is that one approach? A whole series of tools, a whole series of approaches, a whole series of locations. These are the ones right now, the 6 that Aeras is currently involved in, but there are a host of others. Where are these trials happening? Well, Aeras' clinical and epidemiological studies are taking place all around the world, in the U.S., with early stage efforts in both in the clinical trial space. Epidemiologically, we're looking in Asia, in Africa, at several different trials that are currently underway, as well as vaccine trials. I just mentioned the 3-country phase 2B trial that's just began enrollment in Africa just over the past few months. But Aeras, in its evolution, has gone through growth that sees us doing more than just TB clinical trials. In the mid-2000s, we were working on a next-generation recombinant BCG vaccine. But at the time, the strict requirements for working with this, it's a BSL level 2 product, meant that we had it produced, but not the ability to actually get it into syringes or single-use vials for clinical trials. So what that meant at the time, in 2008, was that Aeras built its own vaccine manufacturing facility. The end result was that we could do end-to-end manufacturing, going from master cell line all the way to finished vials under one roof. This served our needs in tuberculosis, but we realized that it could also be leveraged for providing contract manufacturing services to other organizations in need of this capacity. And at the time, a partnership with Crucell on an adenovirus platform put that facility into immediate motion. And those partnerships continued with other organizations and with other platforms over time as this facility came online and developed. So here's TB, this ancient disease of worldwide proportions. And in 2014, it didn't appear to have much in common with Ebola until it did. The adenovirus vaccine platform was one that we were working on, was one that other organizations were working on, including Janssen, a division of Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals. They were working on an Ebola vaccine in 2014, bringing it through to production. These are very different diseases, but they shared this adenovirus platform. And going back years of collaborations with Janssen, they turned to us to help support their accelerated timeline in 2014, getting this vaccine produced and into clinical trials. So there's this shared history between the companies and between the platforms. We, in late 2014, took Ebola bulk drug substance manufactured in the Netherlands and performed fill-finish services for Janssen, including strict Q&A all the way through to delivering finished vials for shipment. And in this photo, taken in late 2014, you see 10 liters of their candidate Ebola vaccine. And at the time, in the media, the hysteria over this vaccine, all the attention it was getting, personally, it was very powerful, striking to be able to see this 10 liters of a vaccine candidate in one location as the world was clamoring for solutions. It was incredible to be even playing a small role in this. So this shared history brought us to November and December of 2014, when Aeras filled more than 11,000 vials of this candidate Ebola vaccine. And here you see one of those vials in the freezer prior to shipping. So what we learned from this process, and I think is probably applicable to tuberculosis, it's probably applicable to vaccines, to all kinds of products that you folks are working on as well, is that together, partnerships, we can achieve more, we can achieve it better, and we can probably achieve it faster. Partnerships are critical. For Aeras, this partnership with Janssen enabled us to play a quick role to bring our expertise to bear on moving a candidate forward for them in a rapid manner. For us, it enabled us to play a role in an emerging global health threat that was in the news. And for the world, it helped move a vaccine candidate forward into clinical trials or toward clinical trials, allowing it, hopefully, to become another tool in the world's toolkit of combating this Ebola threat. So whether to fight TB or Ebola or any other urgent infectious disease threat, new tools are essential. We see that with TB, we see that with Ebola, that R&D towards new tools is critical in the fight. So for vaccines, whether in TB or Ebola or anything else, what's next? What does the future look like? Well, increasing the likelihood of successful and cost-efficient vaccine development requires several things. We've learned this, you have likely learned this, but collaborations are key. TB is an incredibly complex disease, and it's an incredibly complex process developing vaccines to fight it. No one organization is going to do that on its own. Collaborations are essential. Worldwide collaborations are essential to this process. Novel approaches help us accelerate the learning curve. We can't just take one approach and beat it to death. We, as you saw from that complex diagram of the disease process, we've got to look at TB from a holistic perspective and take new strategies to interrupt this disease. Only through exhausting all these options are we going to really find the one that works and works in a way that is accessible, affordable, effective for the world. Greater scientific understanding helps us answer these key questions. TB is certainly a disease where there are a lot of unknowns. Biomarkers, correlates of protection, exactly the platforms, how many adjuvants, how many cassettes, what the adjuvants are going to be, exactly how we're going to approach this has been an evolving process over the last 10 years of vaccine development. Answering those questions, exploring new and different animal models are going to help us get there faster. As we look at this comprehensive take on vaccine development, that helps us maximize our resources. As a nonprofit, we are always struggling with how to be better stewards of donor dollars, and fully exploring all of these options helps us do that, which ultimately helps us bring more and different products to bear to this disease. And defining and differentiating vaccine platforms, we're realizing we have realized is critical to this fight. You saw that pipeline slide with a whole series of different approaches. Several years ago, it used to be almost dogma that we were going to take one candidate and take it all the way through to the end. These expensive clinical trials, we're going to go through, beat this product until it's dead. Whereas now we recognize that we have to have different platforms. We have to diversify. Doing something that's just slightly different isn't going to be enough. That rather than doing that, we need diversity in the pipeline. I liken it to why you don't have much strength in a one-legged stool. You've got to approach TB from several different places, different platforms, diversity of approaches, not necessarily because they're all going to take you through to a phase 3 candidate that's going to get you there, but because different pieces of that puzzle are going to get filled in by those different candidates, informing the models, informing the adjuvants, informing how we get there. We've got to look comprehensively at TB, and likely you have to look comprehensively at the diseases that you're working on, the products that you're working on as well. So all of those things bring us better data, and better data get us to better decision making. That's really what it means for TB, and likely what it means for you as well. Success, we know, is going to be based on transparency, trust, coordination around the world, and amongst various stakeholders with different resources, different priorities, but working together. And together, these partnerships are going to make progress a virtuous cycle, not only for TB and for individuals and organizations, but for the world. So that's it from me on TB. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.